Good evening. I'm not sure. Good evening. Still no? Tana's going to check it out. I always pride myself that I don't need a microphone, but I'm sure I do. Something's unplugged. Welcome, welcome everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello? Okay. We're not getting any signal anywhere. So do we have a good joke? Somebody who can really belt it out. Yeah. What was the latest review about that new restaurant on the moon? Anybody know? No atmosphere. Oh, quit it! That. That's the only one I know. Did that say, oh, yes, woo, all right. What? Oh, you want to hear the joke? All right, here comes the joke. And Ross you have to be quiet. So did you hear the latest on the new restaurant on the moon? No, okay. Great food, but no atmosphere. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Woo, woo, yeah, yeah. All right. Here we go. Dr. Angela Lederach is a cultural anthropologist and a renowned peace studies scholar. She is an assistant professor of peace studies at Chapman University, and I talked to her, and she does beginning students all the way through master's levels, just the whole gamut. She's the author of several books, including this one, Feel the Grass Grow, Ecologies of Slow Peace in Colombia, where some of the stories that she will tell tonight you can also read about in this book. She has 6 years of experience with community-based peace building, slow peace, and restorative justice work in the Philippines, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Colombia, Bolivia, the United States, and Guatemala. That's quite a resume. But there's more. As many of you know, Angie, as I like to call her, was a student here at Hesston College and one of the brightest and the best. She taught us as a student here at Hesston. And I learned today at lunch that even outside of the campus in the classroom, even when she was a babysitter for Kevin and Marilyn Wilder's children, she was a teacher. Particularly their daughter Elizabeth was deeply influenced to become the social justice lawyer that she is today because of Angie. There was a 10-year-old peaceful protest about the trees that were cut down for this very building. I do kind of remember that too. My son JD was a part of that as well. So, Angie lives with her husband Jeff Yoder and 2 children. She is not only a scholar and a writer, but a person who lives her faith, who is following Jesus with her work for peace. Please help me welcome Angie Lederach. I'm going to check this one's, oh, that one's working too.
I'm going to be a lot happier just standing at the podium. Although I can make many things happen. I forgot to do this last night, but Alexis, who's not here anymore, and Chloe and Tana have been doing the sound and the slides and the media, and my family members who can't be here watching the live stream. So I'm just wondering if everybody can give them applause and express a lot of gratitude. I would be very stressed out and panicked, and so I'm very glad that I don't have that role. It's been really lovely to be here at Hesston. It's been such a nice reunion with so many mentors and teachers and friends and family members and colleagues. I had a great day today engaging with students here and learning from the experiences that they've been having, students that just got back from Tulsa, the forms of engagement that are still part of this campus and this campus life. And so I'm really grateful to be with you all. It's perhaps unsurprising that I'm interested in my research on intergenerational peace efforts. I am reminded of the deeper biographical dimensions of that interest while being here at a place where my grandparents, John and Naomi Lederach, worked, at a place where my parents, John Paul and Wendy, taught, at a place where many of my in-laws met and my extended family is kind of deeply invested in this place. And many of whom were shaped by the life and service of Melva Kauffman. And so I'm honored to be here in her name and to think about the ways that we're tethered together here by the threads of a multi-generational commitment, really, to the work of peace and justice that is deeply embedded in the mission and vision of Hesston College. So thank you. For those of you who were not here last night, I have been drawing on the last 10 years of work, specifically in Colombia, to reflect on lessons that I've learned from that place for peace building and for the work of peace with justice. And for those of you who have been here, bear with me as I repeat some of the kind of basic, it's a very surface level history, but I want to make sure that people have a sense of the context, the wider context that I'm talking about. So Colombia is home to one of the longest wars in the Western Hemisphere, which has lasted over 50 years. And the recently signed peace accords in 2016 between one of the largest armed groups, the FARC, and the government of Colombia resulted in a truth commission. And that report was recently released, and they found that the most recent iteration of the war, which they kind of identify as starting in 1985, I will say that most people that I work with in the Northern Territory would say that the first displacement, the original violence, was enslavement, was the transatlantic slave trade. So they date their experience of violence back centuries. But in this most recent iteration, 450,000 people were killed between 1985 and 2018, and 80% of the casualties were civilians. Over 100,000 people were forcibly disappeared. One of the agencies created under the Peace Accords was a special unit for the search of the disappeared, and they continue to do their work. But many families are still looking for the remains of their loved ones. 8 million people were forcibly displaced from their homes. And important in particular for this talk is that 30,000 young people were recruited into various armed groups, because there has not been only one guerrilla organization or armed group. There is also the paramilitaries, which is a right-wing death squad, essentially, that had a lot of collusion with the Colombian state, as well as the ELN. And I have spent the last decade working in a very specific part of Colombia that has been one of the territories most affected by this violence. And so you see, hopefully, it's a little bit hard to see at the bottom is the map of Colombia, and the purple square there is Montes de Maria. And this is located in Colombia's northern Caribbean coast. And between the 1990s and 2005, there were over 100 massacres that took place, mostly against civilian populations. And this was mostly carried out by the paramilitaries, although the FARC was also responsible for a number of episodes of mass violence in this region as well. In addition to this, there were constant assassinations of, in particular, community leaders, so teachers, people who held kind of public roles within their communities, healthcare workers, and arbitrary detentions, so the massive rounding up of whole communities under the accusation that they were terrorist or guerrilla collaborators by the state. And so they were incarcerated without due process. And it was also a region marked by the massive forced displacement of entire communities. In Colombia, and particularly in the rural areas, much of the armed conflict has revolved around questions of land and land rights. And that's deeply tied to wider questions of political participation, which was really consolidated into the hands of just a few elites. And so questions of land or the forced displacement from that land, like the massacres that took place in Montes de Maria, actually map on very, very neatly to the expansion of monoculture plantations through mega agricultural industries like palm oil. So if you look at a map of where the massacres took place today, there are palm oil plantations and increasingly pineapple plantations. And so there's a deep history of violence that's really tied to people's connection to place, to land, and to political participation, or on the other hand, their exclusion from it. And yet, despite this history of violence, this is a region that has been really at the forefront of innovative forms of nonviolent civil resistance. It was home to one of the largest campesino movements in Colombian history, which really centered around demanding agrarian reform and rights to land. And a number of peace communities formed as a way to enact nonviolent protection. So if people heard through a grassroots early warning network that there was likely to be a paramilitary incursion, hundreds of people would gather with just their bodies to protect the person who was targeted for assassination. And this was, part of the way that many of the communities I work with survived throughout the armed conflict. And many of the young people that I have had the pleasure of learning from and working with over the years were also explicitly targeted for recruitment in armed groups. And yet, they have also found ways to resist and refuse that participation, even in the face of life-threatening conditions. At times, that meant that many of the young men fled, that they displaced, that they migrated. They migrated because they were seeking a life of nonviolence. And I think this really challenges dominant narratives about migration, and particularly young brown men, as kind of inherently violent in their migration patterns. For most of the people that I've met and worked with, and this is true also in parts of Central America, many young men flee because they're refusing to join armed groups. And so I think it's really important when we talk about something like sustainable peace, what allows peace to become lasting, is the central role that young people play and the conditions and community networks that allow them to resist forced and coercive forms of recruitment into armed organizations. In 2016, I mentioned this, there's a historic accord that was signed between the government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, which was a leftist guerrilla movement, one of the largest in the country, although not the only one. And today, despite those accords, a neo-paramilitary organization known as the Gulf Clan continues to operate in the region and has actually been expanding its presence in the region. And so these questions about community structures of support that allow people to refuse recruitment and participation in armed groups are not of the past, but are ongoing. It is part of campesino intellectual traditions in an oral context to engage in social analysis and collective reflection through stories. And so I want to try to center a number of stories about the work of the youth as that pertains to their wider intergenerational efforts for peace in their territory. And today I want to open with the birth story of my dear friend and colleague, Naun Alvarez Gonzalez, who was a youth leader from Montes de Maria. And for those who attended yesterday, I talked about his aunt, who is Angelina, and I read one of her poems. Her mentorship of me over the years, especially helping me to understand the deeper experiences of displacement and healing, have really deeply shaped my own understanding of environmental peace building. About 6 months after living in Montes de Maria and working with Naun very closely, my husband, who's in the back, Jeff, and I traveled to Naun's home for the first time. And to get there, we took a 30-minute bus ride to a nearby town and then hopped on a motorcycle for about 30 minutes and then hopped on a boat. These photos are more recent because neither of my kids existed in 2016 and neither did Naun's. We hopped on a boat to cross the reservoir. And when we got to the other side of the reservoir, we then hiked for 30 minutes. And this is my kids' favorite time because that means they get to take a donkey, a burro, and have total freedom in the campo. And so after that journey, we arrived to his community, Camardon, where his mother, Ignacia, greeted us with warm, sweet coffee in a small cup that she had made over an open fire. This is a community that does not have running water, only recently has been able on their own through their own installation create electricity for the community. And after packing our backpacks entirely full with avocados and yams, and you can kind of see the rice hanging from the rafters there, and making sure that our stomachs were full with a homemade meal from their farm, we strung hammocks up because we were very tired at that point, and began to talk about the history of Camardon. Camardon had experienced multiple incursions of various armed factions throughout the armed conflict. The paramilitaries actually set fire to all of the boats, which is the primary way that the community was able to leave and come back. And this was really intended to forcibly displace them. Camardon is a community that remained resistant, which means that the palm oil plantations actually stop right before you get to Camardon. And so when you see the dense forest here, that is unique when you start walking to Camardon. Prior to that, all you see are monoculture palm oil trees. Community leaders, including teachers like Naun's aunt Angelina, were targeted not only by the paramilitaries, but actually by multiple armed groups, including the FARC as well as the ELN. And her name rotated across the list of multiple armed groups, because anytime she survived one death threat by one group, the next group would assume that that necessarily meant she was colluding with them. And so she was on the hit list of multiple armed groups over a period of time and lived under enormous death threats because she had refused to close the school in Camardon. She continued to educate the children there and had refused to displace. And this was true of many family members of Naun's. At the end of the conversation, kind of detailing this deeper history, Naun asked us if we knew how he got his nickname, which was Salvador, which means savior, the one who saves in Spanish, and then proceeded to tell us his birth story. On the day of his birth, guerrilla commanders invaded his community and held his mother and his aunt at gunpoint. And under intense emotional and physical stress, Naun's mother unexpectedly went into labor. At about that time, a torrential rainstorm also hit, and it started ripping off the thatched roof of their home. And this combination of the surprise of a laboring woman and a torrential downpour actually kind of shifted the space. And the guerrilla commanders put down their weapons and they joined the community in patching the roof so that Naun's mother could give birth. And she gave birth to Naun a few hours later. The commanders left, and no one was killed on that day. And that is why they call me Salvador. He smiled. He has a very infectious smile that covers his whole face. The armed conflict in Colombia pervades Naun's entire childhood. He was quite literally born into the war. But equally powerful is that he was born into an intergenerational community of nonviolent resistance. And his nickname and the power of that story for him is actually a reminder of that commitment, of that legacy. That his work as a healer or as a protector, as a peace builder, is deeply salient to how he understands his life in the world. Like his mother and his aunt, he plays today a very key role as a community mediator, and in 2014 became one of the founding members of the Jóvenes Provocadores de Paz, the Youth Peace Provokers movement, which brought young people from across 50 different rural communities together as part of the youth wing of the Campesino movement that I talked more at length about yesterday. That movement is called the Peaceful Process of Reconciliation and Integration of the High Mountain, in part because that movement arose in response to the death of the avocado forest. You can see how enormous the avocados are in Colombia. They're a little bit different than Haas. And so this was really an old growth forest that was destroyed over the course of the war because farmers were not there to attend to the trees and to forest life as a result of these kind of multiple displacements. And this is a context where really deep divisions of enmity were created across communities depending on where different armed groups were based. And so if you were near the Colombian military or the paramilitary, you were seen as sort of being associated with those groups, whereas if you were near the FARC space, you were seen as being associated with the guerrilla movement. And yet, as we know, most people were civilians who were, as many people have told me, just caught in between these groups. In 2014, in response to the death of the avocado forest, this process of reconciliation emerged as a movement, and they led 2,000 campesino small farmers in a nonviolent march that resulted in one of the largest collective reparations processes in the country at the time, to address the harm that was enacted by the war and which recognized for the first time not only the human communities that were affected, but also the avocado forest as a victim of the armed conflict. And one of the very first reparations measures that the movement leaders asked for was a soccer tournament. Like many places across Colombia, the war had deeply frayed social relationships. But it wasn't just the relationships that were fragmented, it was the entire social spaces where people actually met regularly and spent time together and created shared life together. And this was in part because of very repressive silence. I mean, the rounding up and detaining and incarcerating people, incursions and massacres. But it was also because of the erosion of trust. And so that eroded not just relationships between people, but events and festivities and festivals and music concerts and things like soccer that were very important to community life. And so one of the ways that movement leaders thought about reparations was, what does it mean to repair social life beyond just financial and monetary compensation? How do we actually restore the social fabric? And so they requested this soccer tournament that brought together teams from across divided communities for a really celebratory kind of series of games. And a few youth like Naun had participated in organizing the march, but many young people had not. And the underlying assumption was that there were no young people in the rural areas. That because of the armed conflict, because of the loss of economic opportunities, because of the destruction of all of the schools, and because of the presence of kind of active recruitment, they had all displaced. And yet the tournament made people realize that there was actually a really substantial number of young people still living across the rural area. And so on the final day of that soccer tournament, Ricardo Esquivia, who I talked about last night, who is the director of a small grassroots organization known as Sembrando Paz that did a lot of accompaniment work for the facilitating of reconciliation process in the Alta Montaña and later their nonviolent march and the reparations that emerged from that, approached the youth and said, what are we going to do about this? How do we keep these young people involved? And so Naun and a number of other youth, Jokabet Canolis, who I'll talk about, said that they would really like to start a youth wing of the movement. And with the support of one of the accompaniment workers who was volunteering with MCC's program, Semilla, or the SEED program, the youth began to travel out to each of the 50 rural communities that make up this high mountain region. And in each community, they met with youth to see if they wanted to form a youth committee in their community that would then form part of a wider network of a youth movement for peace. And hundreds of youth joined. After a major assembly, they voted to name themselves officially the Youth Peace Provokers. The word provocar in Colombian Spanish means both to desire, so you can say like that sweet juicy mango provokes my desire to eat it, right? So it has this idea of desire in it, as well as to agitate. And so I love this because the name that they chose for themselves has this interplay between the emotional affect of desire with agitation, with nonviolent mobilization, and the ways that those two things are deeply tied together. They also were very clear that they didn't want to be a standalone youth movement, that what they really desired was to be part of a wider intergenerational process. And this became really clear to me as a researcher. The first time I was in the Alta Montaña, I met with a number of leaders, both in the wider movement as well as with the youth. And I had come in thinking I was just going to do a dissertation on the youth because I was very interested in this. And I was using participatory action research methods, which means that people from Sembrando Paz as well as movement leaders were actually helping me to design the research questions that I was creating for my dissertation. And over again, they were like, no, we do not want you to do a project on the youth because that movement isn't just a youth movement. We want you to think about the intergenerational relationships that we're creating as part of our process. Youth in Montes de Maria and within this movement in particular don't limit their understanding of that term to age. So in the US, we often think about that as around the age of 18. It's a little bit flexible, I think. But they didn't really have age markers or social markers. So you could have children and still participate in the youth peace provokers. They had a wider understanding of youth as the relevo generacional, the generational succession of campesino leadership in their communities. And part of what makes you a youth in this context was whether or not you had been able to work towards your life goals, your proyecto de vida, or if you had been prevented from doing so. And the armed conflict, its destruction of schools, its kind of dismantling of education and opportunity, and the increased levels of inequality that had emerged as a result of this had really left young people with very few opportunities. And yet participating in a movement like this one, as one youth told me, allowed young people the ability to dream again, to project themselves into the future. The youth play a really vital role in the movement. They have organized marches, they have organized trainings in peace and nonviolence. They have worked to bring alternative options to young people who otherwise would not have them. And they have done this even in the face of kind of continued forms of threat and presence of violence. And so I think it's important to reflect on the lessons from their work. And I was kind of thinking about three primary ones. So first, for them, peace building really needs to center human and environmental relationships. You can't work to build peace without attention to the relationships of the wider environment and connection to land and place. Second, that peace emerges through intergenerational relationships. And this is really important. And if I put my scholarly hat on, so much of the literature is about generational rifts and divisions. And so it's really interesting to think about the fact that both young people and adults see their work across generations as central to peace building in this context. And the third is the need to center joy. That this plays a really central role in the work of reintegrating communities that have been divided, and also in reclaiming a sense of self and a sense of belonging in the face of really enormous forms of dehumanization that led to their targeted experiences of violence. In the first assembly, the hundreds of youth that were gathered decided on three important aspects of their movement. The first was that they wanted to guarantee gender equality in their organizing structure, and so they have a kind of gender parity leadership structure. The second was that they understood their movement as part of a wider intergenerational process. And the third was that the two pillars that they decided on for peace building within their movement was environmental care and social integration. In 2016, soon after the accords were signed, I sat down with Jokabet, Canoles, and Naun, who were at the time the two coordinators of that movement, to discuss how they saw this national peace process affecting their work. And in particular, what they made of, in the peace accords, there's a territorial focus kind of woven throughout, which was intended to create a participatory mechanism that responded to the distinct forms of violence that took place in different regions of Colombia. And I was really surprised by the reflection that immediately followed. So Jokabet told me there used to exist beautiful fauna and flora in the Alta Montaña. But due to the solitude, due to our displacement, due to the bullets, due to the presence of armed groups, many birds died, many displaced. Without someone planting crops, the birds had nowhere to eat and they died. And so the earth suffered too. The violence inflicted on our communities requires that we fight to build peace from here. The territory is where we live, where we feel good, and therefore we must accommodate the territory so that we can live in peace. The war has also been violent to the environment, and we must reconcile with her. Naun was present in the conversation and nodding vigorously. He's very energetic. And he said, what Hokobet says is so true. When one lives and works and feels the land, I believe that the land also feels this connection. And so in the moment when something is about to happen to the campesino, the earth also cries out. Today, as young people, we are struggling to maintain what is important to us, which is this love of the earth. For us, peace is to be in our territory. I've found across youth narratives about the war, but also their visions for peace, love of the earth comes up over and over again. And it emerges from really deep connection to place as farmers, where mutual relations of care with the soil are forged and sustained. And so environmental care really forms the groundswell of how they understand the work of peace building. And youth narratives of the war in particular also frequently talked about how in the moments right before an incursion or a massacre, the earth went silent. The birds were silent, the hens became silent, the normal sounds, there's a sort of silence that descended. And it was almost like an early warning that for many people gave a split second to hide and to flee. And so they see the earth as protecting them. So this quote from Naun is not abstract, it's really concrete in his experience of the war. Similarly, Hokobet recalled how in the wake of a massacre that was carried out by the FARC in her community, that the community, once they were able to come back together and gather for the first time for a vigil, heard wailing coming from the mountains as they gathered to mourn. And so here the earth cries out, not figuratively or metaphorically, but quite literally. For people like Hokobet and Naun, the land is relationally experienced as living, as alive, as feeling, as sentient. It's a central actor in the work of reconciliation. And for young people in general, whose lives were really uprooted by multiple experiences of displacement, whose families were torn apart, and for whom the wider ecosystem kind of displaced from underneath their feet. Reestablishing a sense of place is deeply rooted to their process of healing in the aftermath of war. To, in the words of Hokobet, reconcile with the earth. And so I want to take two illustrations from their work. From October to November of 2016, Sembrando Paz helped to create and facilitate a river mapping project that mapped various key rivers that lead to the Caribbean Sea. And they did this with a network of youth that included the youth peace provokers, but also included movements from across this region of the 15 municipalities that make up Montes de Maria. And so the youth peace provokers joined young people to map the Palenquillo River, which was one of the rivers that they mapped. It's the main body of water that flows out of the Alta Montaña and down into the Caribbean Sea. And so it's a really central lifeblood for communities where there are no irrigation systems, where there is no electricity. This is the life of those communities. During the planning phase, the youth explicitly developed the river mapping process as an exercise of what they call memoria viva, or living memory. And they invited elders to join them in the process. In particular, they wanted older members of the community to help them to identify not only the native trees and plants and animal species, but more importantly, the histories that were held within the land, the memories that they had, stories and legends, and a kind of connections with the river. And they wanted to know, especially, the kinds of changes that their elders had seen over time. And so on the day that I joined the youth, Jeff was with them the whole time. He's on a horse in the background there. Mango, banana, and old growth trees line the banks of the Palenquillo of this river. The elders pointed out medicinal trees that they use in traditional healing practices. They told stories of river legends and river spirits. And most importantly, they identified really key community landmarks of land recuperations that had established farming communities for the first time, and had advocated for the rights of land against elite landowners that had held most of the land in this region, particularly in the 70s. And so for youth who were born into the war, learning this deeper history of nonviolent action, of land recuperation, of a time before the kind of iteration of the armed conflict that they knew so well, really deepened their own sense of belonging and place. Walking slowly and with intention, we noted when the rock beds beneath our feet turned to sand, and tracked the integrity of the banks of the river. At one point, we saw a troop of howler monkeys, and we craned our necks to make sure we could count each one to put it into the GPS, along with the stories from the elders, the kind of histories that they were told. When they finished mapping the Palenquillo, the youth returned to their communities to present what they had learned, but also to propose ways that they might restore and bolster the health of the Palenquillo River. And they published a short essay together, which they titled, "To Know Our Territory is to Build Peace." And this comes from that essay. To know the river is to know our history, memory, and enchanted places. We lived the river through our bodies. We saw it with our eyes, we felt it, we stepped in it, we bathed in its rich pools. We also lived its pain, the contamination, the erosion, the felling of trees. Everything is connected. The river, the trees, the soil, the plants and animals, human life. We need each other to survive. We must care for what is ours. We can no longer think only of today, but of the future where our children will live. For the youth, knowing the territory and therefore knowing oneself is at the heart of their work for peace building. As Miguel, one of the youth peace provokers who participated in river mapping, reflected, this identity, this sentido de pertenencia, or this sense of belonging to place for our region and for ourselves, is something that we have to create. In the beginning, we called ourselves campesinos, farmers, but then afterwards, they called us the displaced. And after that, they called us the victims, and now they call us survivors. But we haven't asked to be called any of those three things. Neither displaced, neither victims, neither survivors. That's not who we are. We are campesinos. We are farmers. And this is what we must struggle for, to reclaim that identity. The second example from the Youth Peace Provokers that I want to talk about is an annual event they host called the Ecological Beauty Pageant. In Colombia, beauty pageants are a really big deal. They happen in every community, in every city. They're very festive. It's a major cultural event. And so the Youth Peace Provokers have kind of taken this idea that is very well known and recognizable throughout the country and flipped it on its head in a number of ways. It's one of the events that they use to integrate young people from divided and estranged communities. And they call it the ecological cacicasco, the cacicasco ecológico, which takes the colonialist origins of a beauty pageant. In Spanish, it's reinado, which is directly tied to the idea of rey, or the Spanish monarch, the king. And they flip that on its head by calling it a cacicasco. The cacique in Spanish in Colombia is the ancestral and traditional indigenous leader. And so they've used this to kind of play with this idea of where the pageant comes from and to reclaim it as its own. In 2017, they held a multi-day retreat that culminated in an ecological cacicasco, and a cacicasco ecológico. And they chose one of the rural fields that had previously been the base of the FARC in the region. Jokabet opened the retreat with the following. Today, we, the youth peace provokers, are camping in a space once occupied by armed groups. This is transformation. Whereas before there were camouflaged people and weapons and fear, today we have filled the space with the sounds of joyful youth. Hokevet's booming voice through the loudspeaker reached over 300 youth who had gathered for this multi-day event from across the High Mountain region. And they reclaimed one of the very sites of armed conflict that wasn't just the base, but also the site of a lot of confrontations between the various armed groups that operated in the region. It was a place that held a lot of memories of violence and of fear, of targeted recruitment. It was a place that the youth avoided. And now they were camping there for several days, which was very fun. And they had workshops focused on human rights and conflict resolution, on environmental justice, and on political participation. So they had people who came in and trained them on different measures within the Colombian Constitution that allow for mechanisms for youth to participate politically in leadership and governance structures. And they did the same with the peace accords. What were the measures in those accords that were specific to youth? And on the last day, it culminated in this ecological Casicasco. And Hokebet opened the pageant by explaining the significance of the Casicasco. She said, "Our history tells us that there used to be slave auctions to sell our ancestors. And the Spaniards would sit there and say, 'Give me this one or that one.' And this is so ugly to remember." And so as youth peace provokers, we said, no, we're not going to have a reinado. Instead, we're going to have a Casicasco because the figure of the cacique is our ancestral leader. Youth promenaded to the stage in very elaborate outfits that they had made entirely out of recycled materials. And they also, as part of this, had to present a year-long environmental project that as a youth committee they had carried out together within their community. And they had a very esteemed panel of judges, of which I served on. I think most importantly, the ecological Casicasco is fun. It's a great deal of fun. And centering joy is so critical to the work of sustaining the very difficult and often powerless feelings that come with committing yourself to building peace and justice. Joy is also humanizing, and it is contagious. It allows young people who have lived under the weight of not only violence, but dehumanization, to really reclaim a sense of pride in their identities as campesinos. And it allows them to integrate youth from across divided communities, and they have created new memories together, new ways of thinking about what places mean to them and what stories those places hold for them. It is a way of imagining and creating a dignified life and future in the campo, in the countryside. And so what do these two examples, the river mapping process and the ecological Casicasco, teach us? The first is the need to integrate an understanding of the central role that environmental relations play in the work of peace and justice. In the words of the late Pope Francis's remarkable encyclical Laudato Si, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend the text, quote, "A true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor." Second, the work of peace and justice requires intergenerational relationships of solidarity. As Naun explained to me, when the social fabric is broken, it's not easy to restore it, which is why it's important to reclaim our culture as campesinos. You see, we are the children of this process. That is, we are born from the peaceful movement, and we are working together so that the adult process and that of the young people is what will maintain and will carry on this process of peace, so that this is something that will never end. Understanding peace building in these terms actually refuses dominant ways that we often talk about peace as having a final end or as occurring at the signing of an accord. and instead really thinks about the ways that peace building needs to be actively and continuously built and cultivated. It's indeterminate. It requires the ability to imagine and work towards a collective future of dignified life across multiple generations and really deep time horizons that connect ancestral memories to desired futures and to agitate for that future and to do so with joy. For both elders and youth in Montes de Maria, creating intergenerational efforts for peace creates a sense of possibility and hope. And many of the youth today participate in the wider coalition across Montes de Maria that I talked about yesterday, which is the Regional Space for Peace Building. It's a broad-based coalition, brings together hundreds of grassroots movements from within just a small territory. And it's been very important to have youth actively involved in that process. As Jolis Correa, who's a campesina organizer and a member of the regional space, reflected on that work, she said, "What I've found here in the regional space is a space where we can build the social fabric of the territory. We don't all think the same, but what does exist is respect. And what is it that allows this respect? That there are people who have experience that carry with them in everyday life, which is not only what they are living today, but what they have lived before, so this past history. But that there is also projection. For example, Naun has a broader projection than I have. So there's also this vision, and we have to contribute to that vision." She paused and then she added, "This is not Santos's peace." So Santos at the time was the president who had brought forth the peace negotiations with the FARC. "This is not Santos's peace or the FARC's peace. This is my peace. This is your peace. This is the peace of the people in the high mountain and also the people who live at the mouth of the river. Territorial peace is when I believe in myself and in my territory, when I believe that everything is possible. You see, the territory is everything that I have. From here," she placed her hand on her chest before gesturing outward, "palante. The first territory is my body. It's my position. This is where my territory starts, and it must be respected. Where I respect myself and they respect me, this is territorial peace, where we can live together widely. To live together widely or abundantly requires respect across generations. Across the world, we're living in a moment where grave threats to and profound disregard for life raise really significant questions about our pursuit for peace and justice in this world. And yet, as the late Quaker peace studies scholar Kenneth Boulding used to say, if it exists, it's possible. If a small group of young farmers who were born into the war in Colombia can regenerate the ecological lands of their home, threatened with extinction, and rebuild relationships torn apart by political violence, then it's also possible here in Hesston, Kansas. And it's possible in places like Iran and Sudan and Palestine. Intergenerational movements like those that Naun and Hokabet are leading exist across the world. Last August, I joined hundreds of youth leaders from all over the world for a global peace building summit that was organized by Global Unites, which is a network of movements, of youth movements from across the world that emerged out of Sri Lanka. And hundreds of youth gathered to share about the incredible work that they are doing to build peace under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. From Sri Lanka to the DRC to Nepal, young people are leading and creating new spaces for peace, even in the face of persistent violence and authoritarian control. Despite continued violence in Montes de Maria and the expansion of the neo-paramilitary organization in recent years, the work of Hokabet and Naun continues. And these community-based efforts have been really critical for creating different alternatives for young people who have no other way or path out. In a moment when various systems that sustain life feel as if they're collapsing or being actively dismantled, when the daily onslaught of forces intent on destroying life confront us every morning in the headlines. The US bombing of small fishing boats in the Caribbean Sea, including small fishermen off the coast of Colombia. The now over $22 billion spent on the US-led war in Iran. The terror of ICE raids and the unleashing of federal agents on our communities. And increased polarization that has torn apart relationships with friends and neighbors, as well as the ongoing genocides and ethnic cleansing campaigns that ravage places like Gaza and Sudan, Myanmar, the war in the DRC. Hope can feel really far away. And yet, as I've learned from friends across Colombia, it's actually leaning into our place, our community, our territory, and attending to the relations and friendships that can animate and sustain collective action in the face of violence, that a grounded hope through action is nurtured. Ricardo Esquivia, the director of Sembrando Paz, often reflects that the task of peace builders, the number one task of peace builders, is to become vigías de la esperanza, vigías of hope. Vigía, as it is used here, I don't think has a very easy translation in English, but it comes from the Latin word vigil. And vigil has many meanings attached to it. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a vigil is when you stay alert to guard something, but a vigil is also solemn, as when a candlelight vigil is held for victims of a tragedy. Vigil comes from the Latin word awake, and all its meanings include the idea of wakefulness. To build peace, then, is to be continuously wakeful to the possibilities of hope found in the weave of everyday life, or as Ricardo reflected, echoing the words of the late Kenneth Boulding, we have to become vigías de la esperanza, vigías of hope. We need to be able to see small, practical things that show us that this is possible. It's like that phrase, if it exists, it's possible. And I think this is key. For me, it's found in the small things. Maybe I will never see it, but I believe we will achieve it. This is hope, and we embody it. So I'll end with the words of Ricardo, which I usually try to do in most of my talks, because his wisdom has much to offer us. And we can open for questions and responses and reflections, things that you're sitting with. I believe we have about 15 minutes and can continue also after those 15 minutes over cookies.
At the beginning, you said there was still a Gulf clan. Will that affect the peace that's going on in the area?
Yeah, I mean, it affects it very dramatically. So the peace accord was really only with one of the guerrilla organizations, but there are multiple armed groups. And in many communities, when the FARC left, it actually opened up this space because the state has not been present in terms of its public policies. It's been very present in terms of its military presence. So sometimes people talk about state absence in places like Monte de Maria, but the state's very present. It's just present in the form of the Marine base. But there's no healthcare centers or education centers, right? So public policies that you might associate with the state are not there. And in many ways, leftist guerrilla organizations like the FARC filled that role, created community projects, in addition to the kind of armed revolution that they were carrying out. And so when they left, there was a vacuum in a lot of places, and that vacuum has been filled in the absence of the state and state programs with the expansion of a neo-paramilitary organization. So it has its roots in the paramilitary structure. It's deeply tied to a lot of multinational corporations, and it is a criminal organized network. So it's very different than some of the armed organizations that had at least a semblance of a political ideology. And the Gulf Clan controls, for example, the Darien Gap. So a lot of the severe kind of violent experiences of migration out of South America across the Darien Gap are controlled heavily by the Gulf Clan. And they've increased their presence and expanded their presence in Montes de Maria and in various places across the country. So it's a concerning time to kind of witness that heightened violence. But it's also not new to this place. And so a lot of what people are engaging in right now is rethinking what are the forms of nonviolent collective protection that they can engage in and also demand of from the state, but also the international community. And they're kind of retooling forms of nonviolent resistance that they used during the war to confront and engage with this organization today. In other parts of the country, this is not true for Montes de Maria. The ELN is also still present, which is a guerrilla organization. So you do have, and since the signing of the accords, a number of dissident groups, so FARC members who were part of the peace process, who have broken off to create new armed dissident groups, have also formed. Since the signing of the peace accord, over 1,000 social leaders and human rights defenders have been assassinated in Colombia. So there has been kind of continued forms of violence, and it's very hard because the discourse of a lot of people is that it's a post-conflict setting, which is clearly not true in the daily lives of people. But I really think that this question of what are the opportunities for youth? How are they participating in political life? What are their avenues for education? To be able to study in college, the youth that I work with had to overcome enormous barriers. And many of them, as a result of being in the movement, actually were able to create networks that allowed them to achieve that, which is remarkable. That's just not a door that is open to many rural youth. And so thinking about those alternative spaces and becoming part of collective nonviolent movements, I think is one of the fundamental ways to ward off and prevent the expansion of organizations like the Gulf Clan. But it is a concerning moment. So thank you for the question. Yeah. Other questions, reflections, comments?
Do you plan to do any work in the U.S., like involving, because I know things are kind of like disoriented, I guess, between our government and youth groups. So I just want to know if you're planning to do like any work here.
Yeah. So I talked about Global Unites, and Global Unites has a chapter in the United States. They're often connected to different colleges. And so I've worked a little bit with some of the chapters that have been created among youth in the US who are interested in learning about peace-building efforts in other places of the world and trying to apply that in their communities. And so in terms of youth-engaged work, that's one area that I've been involved in. And then most recently, I'm part of mutual aid and rapid response networks in the greater Los Angeles area in an attempt to protect immigrant youth and their families from federal agents, to be quite frank. But that's been a very difficult process in terms of what it is actually like to accompany, for example, in August, my kids had to leave because they can't sit in a bench for longer than 10 minutes. They saw pictures of themselves and then got cookies. But we were accompanying a family who went to their asylum hearing, and which is the legally required process when you're seeking asylum. And at the point of the door of entering the building for that asylum hearing, which they're legally required to do, the mother was abducted by ICE. And her 3 kids, the oldest of whom was 8, who is neurodivergent, 6 and 18 months old, were left by themselves on the street in front of the building, right? And so I'm part of a mutual aid network that responded immediately to that and made sure that they were taken to a place where they could have shelter. And then we gathered with my kids school items for them because they were about to start school. And when the mother was taken, they lost access to the house they were living in, all of their things, all of their access. And we've since been accompanying that family throughout the year. So that's just one example, but I also see that there are many young people who are involved in those kinds of mutual aid networks in the area where I live, which has been kind of in the heart of some of these targeted raids. So those are the 2 areas right now, and I find myself constantly drawing on work from Columbia, whether that's thinking about how you do human rights documentation, which includes recording and making sure that this is how you prevent a forced disappearance, is actually trying to track where people are being taken and connect their families to them and their lawyers to them. This is at the heart of human rights work. And so there's a lot of lessons from Columbia that I feel like I'm constantly drawing in that into that work. I don't know if that answers your question. On whatever day it was, yesterday, feels like a long time ago in formation, I encouraged people to think about your 5 skills or strengths, because those are really different for every person. And so some people are going to be like out in front, kind of more confrontational or agitational, and other people are going to be listening really carefully across different kinds of divides and bringing different groups together. And I think we have a tendency in the US to think in either or terms. But I think for peace building, what is needed is a both and. How do you actually combine those different skills together, because they're all needed? So accompanying a family and providing support for them, taking them to a park, having them play with other kids, is just as important as kind of showing up to a large protest or a mobilization. And actually, it's the combination of those different efforts that I think more resiliency is built.
Can you give us a little more background on or just fill it in on the global economic context? I've noted, so from my sort of limited knowledge about Colombia, it's narcos, maybe a few other things, a lot of the war on drugs stuff, which you haven't touched on, and that's interesting to me. So just to fill in some of that stuff, it's an open,
yeah, I mean,
and
so
grounding it into what we do, what is present in our lives right now is the ICE activities.
Yeah. There are a couple of reasons why I don't often talk about coca or narcos. One of them is because I don't actually work in a region that grows coca, and so hasn't been affected in the same way with the eradication campaigns. But coca is just a plant, and it was a plant that actually provided forms of subsistence for a lot of farmers who are very, very poor. And there is a very false perception of Colombia, thanks to popular programming like Narcos, that the war is about drugs or about drug trafficking. And that's simply not true. That's a condition or a kind of, a consequence or a consequence of the war. The war really revolves around is enormous inequality and forms of political and social exclusion that were compounded and entrenched in the early years. In Montes de Maria, people would say you can't talk about the war without talking about colonization and enslavement, because actually that was the start of the hacendados, of these huge tracts of elite landowners, where people took over and the expansion of a kind of plantation monoculture model. But that became exacerbated in terms of global economic policies with structural adjustment programs that were really enacted through the IMF and the World Bank under, in particular in the 80s, kind of under the Reagan administration. And it required countries like Colombia to basically get rid of a lot of their social programs and to open up for private sector investing. Colombia is very interesting because it has a very long, strong history of union labor organizing. And so that's been one of the ways that has been very important for kind of working against the enormous inequality, land being held in the hands of the very few, and those few also holding political positions. And in Colombia, it's very interesting. It's like you're either a huge landowner, like you either come from a huge land-owning family or you come from a big media giant. And you could think about those in partisan terms, but in both of those cases, that comes from a very elite, limited space of just a few families who hold that kind of enormous power. So this is a pretty big gloss, but I would say at the root of the continued cycles of violence is enormous amounts of inequality and a lack of opportunity or the ability to participate, both meaningfully in political life, but also just economic life. So if coca is something that allows you to stay in your territory, allows you to farm, allows you to be in your homeland that has these kind of deep ancestral ties, then that is, part of the subsistence that people and kind of economic generation that people engage in. And a lot of Plan Colombia, which was part of the US foreign policy during the war, eradicated through aerial fumigation coca farmers' lands. And so this killed the soil entirely. So it wasn't just coca that was eradicated, it really destroyed soil life, and that continues to have persistent consequences. I talked about the idea of slow violence, so thinking about aerial fumigation, the poisoning essentially of farming land. And so I think that kind of understanding those economic inequalities and how those are linked together with political exclusion and deeper forms of dehumanization of particular groups of people, specifically Black, Indigenous, and Campesino communities on the rural areas, but also LGBTQ individuals were disproportionately targeted with gender-based violence during the war, and did an incredible job creating safe houses, kind of peace houses in the middle of the war for people who were queer to find safe haven in. And so there's a really long history, even in rural areas where I work with a number of trans activists and queer activists in this like very rural farming area of Colombia who created safe houses. And they sit together in coalition with one another, with older farmers, with indigenous leaders. And part of what I think allows them to work together is a shared recognition of the dehumanizing violence that they've experienced. And they understand that they've experienced it in different ways, but there's something quite recognizable across that. So I know that's a gloss, but that'll be my response. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I have loads of book recommendations if anybody wants to follow up for them. I know if there's any burning questions, feel free to do that. It's also 8:15 on a Thursday night, and there's cookies in the back. And so I'm very happy for those of you who don't want to talk into a microphone but want to talk to me, to meet back there and to have conversation with you, and also to hear about what you're involved in and learn from your work. So thank you very much.
here in our part of the world. So thank you once again. Enjoy cookies and conversation.